Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome back. We're diving into some major news today. A big agreement just signed between the United States and Ukraine.
That's right. It's about Ukraine's mineral resources, and it's something confirmed by both sides, the U.S. Treasury and Ukraine's economy ministry.
And this wasn't just whipped up overnight, was it?
No, not at all. They've apparently been in talks since, well, early February, so quite a bit of groundwork laid.
So what's the core of it? What did this agreement actually do?
It sets up a joint investment fund. The main goal, really, is to help kickstart Ukraine's economic recovery.
Okay, a joint fund. And we heard from the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent.
Yes. He made a statement. He talked about the current U.S. administration's commitment, wanting to see a peaceful, free, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine.
So positioning this very much within a sort of broader strategic goal for the region.
Exactly. It frames it not just as an economic deal, but as part of a bigger picture for Ukraine's future and stability.
Interesting. And alongside this economic agreement, there's something else happening involving conditions for ending the conflict.
Yeah, that's also emerged. Reports from the U.S. Special Representative Keith Kellogg. He mentioned 22 specific conditions presented by the U.S. to Ukraine.
22. That's quite specific.
Very specific. And according to Kellogg, Ukraine has actually agreed to them.
Agreed to them. So you have this resource deal and these peace conditions happening around the same time. Makes you wonder if they're connected.
The timing certainly is suggestive, isn't it? Perhaps the economic support is, linked somehow to progress on the political or conflict resolution side. It's complex.
Let's dig into the resource deal specifics then. Ukraine's Minister of Economy, Yulia Seredenko, she offered some details.
She did, and crucially, she emphasized that all the resources in Ukraine, they remain Kyiv's property, completely under Ukrainian control.
That seems like a really important point to make up front. Addresses potential concerns about sovereignty.
Absolutely. Dispels any idea that this involves the U.S. somehow taking ownership. It's clear. Ukraine owns its resources.
Okay, so ownership is clear. What about managing this new fund?
It's going to be jointly managed, U.S. and Ukraine together, but neither side gets a deciding vote or a veto.
Ah, so a balanced approach, a partnership model sounds like.
That seems to be the intent. Collaboration, mutual agreement on how the funds are used, building trust, maybe.
And does this deal touch existing state-owned companies or privatization efforts in Ukraine?
No, Seredenko is clear on that too. This agreement doesn't change anything there. State companies stay Ukrainian property, managed as they are now.
So it's focused purely on, what, new developments?
It seems so, focused on the potential unlocked by new resource projects rather than changing the existing economic structure.
Another point often a concern with these kinds of deals is debt. Does this create new debt for Ukraine?
Apparently not. The agreement specifically avoids creating any new debt obligations for Ukraine towards the U.S. That's obviously pretty significant given the context.
Hugely significant. So it's structured as investment, not a loan.
Exactly. Supporting recovery without adding to the financial burden.
Okay, so if it's not debt, where does the money for the fund actually come from?
Right, a funding mechanism. It's solely from income generated by new licenses, specifically for critical materials projects and also oil and gas projects within Ukraine.
So the fund's capital is directly tied to getting these new resource projects off the ground.
Precisely. It creates a direct loop, develop resources under new agreements, and that income fuels the recovery fund.
And to sweeten the pot for investors, I gather there are tax benefits.
Yes, quite significant ones. Any income the fund generates and any contributions to it will be tax exempt, and that applies in both the U.S. and Ukraine.
That could definitely make these projects more attractive, reducing the friction for capital coming in.
It's a strong incentive, for sure. Could really help draw in investment on a global scale.
And the U.S. isn't just relying on American companies, right? They're helping Ukraine attract others.
Correct. The U.S. has pledged to actively help bring in investment and technology, not just from American sources, but also from the EU and, well, other countries too.
So using U.S. leverage to facilitate a broader international effort.
It looks that way. Bringing in diverse capital, but also crucial expertise and maybe advanced technologies for resource extraction.
What about the long view? How will the fund's income be used initially?
The expectation, according to Minister Seredenko, is that for the first 10 years, the income will be plowed back into Ukraine, reinvested in new projects or general reconstruction efforts.
10 years of reinvestment focus, that signals a pretty long-term commitment.
It does, prioritizing building capacity and driving growth within Ukraine first before, potentially discussing other uses down the line. The terms beyond 10 years are apparently still to be discussed.
Now, this agreement didn't just appear today. There was a lead-up.
Yes, there was a memorandum of intent signed back on April 18th. That basically set the stage, outlined the goals, aiming to speed up work on this very resource deal.
And that memo also mentioned the U.S. support already given since 2022, and this idea of a reconstruction fund strengthening the partnership.
Exactly. It framed the context ongoing U.S. support, the desire for lasting peace, and this fund as a key element. They were actually aiming to finalize the deal by April 26, so they were moving quickly.
It's interesting. Wasn't the original plan to sign this even earlier, like during President Zelensky's Washington visit in February?
That seems to have been the initial hope, yes. It got delayed for some reason, but Zelensky himself later said he was ready to sign it anytime, any format. He saw it as important for security guarantees.
So high priority from the Ukrainian side, clearly.
Definitely seems that way. Viewed as critical for stability and the economy.
Looking back even further, I remember reading about an earlier draft, maybe 11 points. Reported by the Financial Times.
Ah, yes, the bilateral agreement on establishing the rules and conditions of a reconstruction investment fund. That draft proposed Kiev putting 50% of revenue from state-owned resource sales, minerals, oil, gas into the joint fund.
50%. That sounds different from the final version focusing on new licenses.
It does. That earlier version seemed focused on existing revenue streams being channeled into this fund for reinvestment in security and prosperity projects. The U.S. pledged long-term commitment in that draft, too. The final deal seems to have shifted the funding source.
Which suggests some significant negotiation happened between that draft and the final agreement.
Almost certainly. Refining the financial mechanics, the governance, the scope that's typical, the focus on new revenue might have been a key point.
And this whole idea of sort of Western access or partnership regarding Ukraine's resources, wasn't that part of Zelensky's victory plan from last year?
It was. Back in October 2024, point 4 of his plan talked about strategic economic potential. It proposed an agreement for joint protection and investment in critical resources, things like uranium, titanium, lithium, graphite, valued potentially in the trillions.
Trillions? Wow. And wasn't there a connection mentioned with Senator Lindsey Graham?
There were reports suggesting Senator Graham, who supports President Trump, actually recommended including that point in the plan.
Interesting. That suggests maybe some bipartisan interest in the U.S., or at least recognition of the resource potential there.
It could point to that, yes, seeing Ukraine's resources as significant for future partnerships, regardless of political lines.
Okay, let's circle back to those 22 conditions for ending the conflict that Keith Kellogg mentioned. He said Ukraine agreed to them.
That's what he stated on Fox News, yes. Presented by the U.S., agreed to by Ukraine. If that holds true, it's potentially a very big step towards some kind of resolution.
And Kellogg also touched on the potential terms, suggesting the U.S. might be prepared to recognize Russian territorial claims, at least partially.
He did indicate that, and that Ukraine might be ready for a ceasefire where both sides just stay where they are currently positioned.
Which would mean acknowledging the reality on the ground, the territory lost, even if not formally recognizing it legally.
Exactly. That's the difference between de facto, the practical reality, and de jure, the legal recognition. The U.S. might accept the de facto situation without granting de jure sovereignty to Russia over those areas. It's a way to stop the fighting without formally rewriting maps under international law, at least immediately.
Kellogg also mentioned these conditions were hammered out in London around April 23rd, and that, well, Ukraine didn't initially like all of them.
Right. He said they were very specific conditions and acknowledged not all were initially favored by Kyiv. That implies some tough negotiations, probably compromise involved.
It suggests Ukraine might have had to make some difficult choices to reach this reported agreement.
That would certainly seem likely, given the stakes and the complexity of the situation. Resolving a conflict like this inevitably involves hard trade-offs.
And are there more specific reports about what this potential settlement might look like on the ground?
There are reports, yes. They suggest the U.S. plan might involve de jure recognition of Russian control over Crimea, so legal recognition now, but only de facto, practical control over parts of the east and south.
Okay, so Crimea treated differently from other occupied areas.
That's what these specific reports suggest. But they also mention potential returns to Ukraine, like the Kharkiv region, control over the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant.
The nuclear plant, that's huge.
Absolutely. And the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, too. Plus guarantees for shipping on the Dnieper River and Ukraine controlling the Kinburn Spit.
So it sounds like a really complex potential map. Some recognition of Russian gains, but also restoration of Ukrainian control over some key strategic areas and infrastructure.
It definitely paints a picture of a very detailed, negotiated outcome, trying to balance the realities on the ground with Ukraine's strategic needs and maybe some territorial restoration. It's a lot to unpack, and of course depends on these reports being accurate and the agreements holding.
Absolutely. A lot of moving parts, and we'll be watching closely. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.